Hello folks, this is Neil here in the workshop. Behind the camera is Gail, who is the photography expert in the family. She'll be taking the video. And today we're going to talk about care and feeding of the carbide lamp. These little lamps were originally developed for use by miners to replace the little oil lamps that they previously used. Carbide, or calcium carbide as it's fully known, came into common use around 1900, and it was used in many applications to provide light. There were lamps for bicycles, lamps for carriages, and later the early cars. And one of the primary uses was by miners, and they developed for the miners these little lamps. And this was referred to as a 2-hour lamp, because when it was loaded up and properly used, it would burn for about 2 hours. This is the calcium carbide, and it has to be kept stored in a closed container because it will absorb moisture from the air. And the way it works is, when water gets into the carbide, it forms a very highly flammable gas called acetylene. And originally this came in little rocks or chunks, but even closed up tight over time it will gradually break down into this powder. But the powder is perfectly usable as a light source, just like the rocks are. There were dozens of different manufacturers of these carbide lamps for miners. I've got two examples here. This is an auto light made by the Universal Lamp Company in Springfield, Illinois. And then this one is a Just Right, manufactured by the Just Right Company in Chicago. And I first got involved with carbide lamps in the 1960s and 70s. I lived in the Southwest and was involved in a lot of cave exploration. And cavers had adopted these miner lamps as their preferred source of light in that era. And today they've been largely replaced by LED headlamps, so you don't see these too much anymore. Now there are other videos on YouTube about how to use carbide lamps, and they provide a lot of good information. But I think there are some very important points to know about using these correctly. They're relatively simple, but if you don't keep some of these points in mind, you can have a lot of problems with your lamp. So I call them VIPs, or very important points. And the first one is to put your lamp together correctly. The lamp just has a few parts, but they have to be placed in the right order. Now inside here, you can see there's a tube coming down from the top, and that's what brings the water into the carbide chamber. And then there's a small hole which takes the acetylene gas out of the carbide chamber up into the burner tip. On the front there's a reflector, and the older lamps usually had a very small reflector, like this one. Later they went to a larger reflector, more highly polished, which gave better illumination. So there are three pieces that go into the base of the lamp, laid out on the bench here. And the first one is called the felt plate, not because it's made of felt, but because it's next to the felt and holding it in place. And you can see it has holes in it, and it's slightly domed, if you can see that. And the purpose of that is to create a little pocket under here for the acetylene to collect in before it goes through this hole up into the tube. So that goes in first, just slides onto the little bar. Next, you have a little filter of felt. And the purpose of this is to keep any of the spent carbide from making its way through that hole and clogging the burner tip. So you just slip that on and push it into place. And finally you have the felt holder. That also slips on, and those two little prongs there provide a friction fit so that it stays in place. The acetylene gas travels up and out of this burner tip here. I have one laid on the bench. It's a little brass with a ceramic insert that's tapered, and it just fits into the hole by a friction fit. So if your burner tip ever happens to fall out of your lamp, just pick it up with a pair of pliers and twist it back into place. And then the reflector is held on by a little wing nut here, and next to that is the lighter. And here's one on the bench. And that in the lighter, it has a spring-loaded flint, very similar to the ones that are used sometimes in cigarette lighters. This little cap screws off and the flint goes up inside there. And then there's a knurled wheel here that when you turn it, it gives you a spark. And that spark will start the acetylene. Now on top is this part is called the water jacket, or the water pocket. And on the top here there's a little lid on a swivel that opens up. You can put water in there and then it goes up again. And then on top here there's a rod, and by turning that rod you regulate the water flow, which comes out. There's a little joint right here, and as you turn that, it's so small that you really have a hard time seeing it even up close. But that little joint there lets water drip through. And how much water you give will depend on the size of your flame. And this is the second of the very important points. If you give it too much water, it will actually flood the lamp. You have a huge flame for just a minute or two, and then it'll go out. So the length of your flame ideally would be about 1 inch long. That'll give you the maximum amount of reflected light. And I've handled dozens of these, and they all seem to be slightly different in the water regulation. When this is pushed, this lever is pushed as far as you can go to the left, it closes off the water flow. Then as you pass these little detents, and you can hear it click, that increases the water flow. Where many people have trouble is they give it too much water flow and they get a terrific long flame for a few minutes, and then it's used up all the carbide and you're done. So you want to regulate that before you put the bottom on. Hold it up, turn the lever one click at a time until you start to see the water drip. And ideally you want it to drip about once every 2 seconds. That's a good speed at which you can get an inch long flame. So that's the second of the two very important points, not to give it too much water. The third point to consider is how full to fill it. You don't want to completely fill this can. If you do, when the carbide expands from the water dripping on it, it will completely move up in here and plug the felt, and you won't get any flow of gas at all. So ideally you want about 2/3 of a can, no more than that. So if you have the water adjusted correctly, proper amount of carbide in the can, It'll burn for about 2 hours. They also made larger versions, 4-hour burners. Those were generally carried in the hand, and usually they had a hook on them where they could be hammered into a mine timber. In the early days, the miners would put these on cloth caps, and then later, as safety became a bigger issue, they went to a hard cap, very similar to the hard hats that we have today. And there were 2 ways of attachment for the lamps. As you can see on this one, there's a flat blade, and that would slip down inside a bracket on the front of the miner's cap. The second method of attachment had a single prong that you would hook through a hole in the bracket on the front of the cap, and it had 2 prongs that spread out in each side to provide stability so the lamp wouldn't rock back and forth. Mostly this type was preferred by the cavers. There were various accessories that you could get for your lamp. This one is called a tip cleaner. Has a little sleeve here to protect this bundle of fine little wires, and you can use those wires to poke into your burner tip if it happens to get clogged. Also, if you're working in a very windy environment, sometimes the wind would blow the flame out, so you could get a little flame protector that just slips on over the wing nut on the front of the reflector. But the drawback to those is it cuts down considerably on the amount of illumination that you have. Alright, let's say you're through using your lamp, but it's still burning, so what do you need to do next? Well, don't unscrew the bottom, and don't just turn off the water flow. Let it continue burning, put it somewhere where the flame won't do any harm, and wait till it's through burning. Well, that'll mean the acetylene production has stopped. Then you can take the bottom off, and in the bottom you'll find a lot of whitish residue, what we call the spent carbide, and that is poisonous, and you don't want to put it anywhere that animals or children can get at it. You want to dispose of it properly. And the place to dispose of it, it can be problematic. If your local town has a hazardous material day, then put this spent carbide in some kind of a airtight container and take it to that disposal. If they don't have such a day, then probably you should just contact your local authorities and find out the proper way to dispose of it. You definitely don't want to flush it down the toilet, let it get into the water system. When you remove it from the can, use a piece of stick to scrape it out. Make sure it's all out of there. And then disassemble the lamp parts here and clean them out, and especially wash the filter in some water. There won't be enough spent carbide in it to do any harm if you wash it out in a bucket of water and then dry it thoroughly before you use it again. Well, that's the story of carbide lamps, and if you follow those 3 very important points, I think you won't have any trouble with your lamp. First of all, put it together correctly, regulate the water flow correctly, and use the proper amount of carbide. Thanks for watching.